What's up, Florian?
Hey, Greg. Doing great. How are
Yeah.
you?
Good. Doing great. So I think we're live. Thanks everybody for coming. I'll kick off. I'm the head of product at MetaRouter. MetaRouter spends a lot of time interfacing with not only privacy controls, but user behavioral data and information. And so we thought it was a good opportunity to, as Google has kind of shifted gears on the way that they're thinking about the death of cookies and privacy controls within Chrome and how information gets shared. We kind of spent a lot of time studying that evolution in the previous iteration and are preparing for what Google's doing next, and thought it would be a good chance to kind of dig deeply into what the implications of sort of the prior model and the current model really are for businesses and for advertising sort of industry incumbents, and kind of unpack that a little bit, and then maybe talk about what people can be doing to prepare for these changes as they evolve. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. On my side, I'm Florian Delval, Technical Product Marketing Director at ActionIQ. ActionIQ is a composable CDP that helps you take action on your customer data. So really provide access and let marketers, advertisers use that data, which is really relevant again on all the changes we're seeing in the data space with Google deprecation and finally not deprecation of third-party cookies.
Nice. Well, thanks for joining, man. So I think, the general overflow or overview of what I think would be helpful to cover is a little bit, it's difficult to know where we're going if we don't know where we've been. So I think it would be helpful to cover a little bit about what Google tried to do, both with Privacy Sandbox and their general efforts around privacy with Chrome. And why ultimately I think they pivoted away from that initial strategy. And then I think the second thing would be, what they're going to do now. Again, there's a ton of speculation in this. All we know at this stage is a couple of paragraphs from the VP of Privacy Sandbox at Google, talking a little bit about, that they're going to move to a new model, but we don't know a ton of details about that. But we do have some good industry analogs to pull from. So I think we can get a reasonable point of view around how things are going to look. And then the last topic would be essentially what you can do to prepare for the new world, what parts of what you were doing to prepare for the death of cookies are still relevant, and what parts probably have changed, and what, kind of the core tenets of how to shift those investments, those preparation investments into, the changed model and what that looks like. And then lastly, we'll open it up to QA, I think, on the various platforms that people are tuning in from. You can ask questions. We've got a moderator who will throw those up on the screen, if they're selected. So we'll kind of go from there. Anything you want to add before we get started?
No, that sounds like a great plan. Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, cool. So the first topic, what Google tried to do, I think, the heart and soul of what Google was attempting to do with Privacy Sandbox, I think, was to obfuscate direct, uninhibited access to customer behavioral data by the advertising industry, and to put tighter controls around how that data was shared. And the means by which they tried to do that was to centralize a lot more of the information flow and the calculation and the evaluation of identity and behavioral data and advertising mechanics like conversion and attribution and audiencing and bidding into Chrome. And I think optically, initially, that was a big challenge for them because people thought Google was trying to control all the information. And I think having looked at it, it really was Chrome. It was really your personal Chrome browser that you could clear or uninstall or delete at any time. And the APIs within Chrome that they built, our general take was that they were generally pretty viable. I think there were some things that were missing. I think it was a stronger platform for things like retargeting. It obviously was a strong platform for web. Didn't have a lot of great answers for cross-device and multi-channel and other things. But it was a pretty good option for web-based advertising. And the three APIs that they presented as part of it had answers for things like conversion and attribution, had answers for things like retargeting audiences, and had answers for things like archetypal information and topics information. and sort of trying to replace some of those core mechanics that the industry relies on in order to run a marketing, advertising, and media ecosystem. But I think there were a few challenges with it. The first was obviously the regulatory environment saw it as an anti-competitive move. I think it's difficult to conceptualize someone controlling all the information when they also have the lion's share of the advertising industry revenue and business. And I think that's why when, say, Apple tries to implement similar controls with Safari and iOS, it's fine because Apple doesn't really run an advertising business. But because Google does, I think it was seen by regulatory environments as pretty anti-competitive. I think the second challenge with it was that it required massive industry change. I think a lot of incumbents and players in the space, let's call it, Trade Desk and Meta and people who run similarly huge advertising ecosystems, they would have had to completely reinvent a lot of the technology that they had relied on for years and years and years, completely changing the way that they calculated information, that they received information, the way that they ran their revenue models, the way that they charged their customers, the way that they, attributed ads and delivered information. It was a pretty massive technological change that required a lot of investment from the rest of the industry in order to adopt to it. And I think there was some pushback on that. And then I think the last thing that I would call out, and then I'll hand it over to get your take, Florian, is I think the way Google tried to solve the problem of privacy was to control the information better, rather than giving controls to the users for how to control the information. And I get why they wanted to do that. I think the common individual is not super educated on how their data gets used or how they should be advocating for their own privacy. And so I think giving controls around your privacy to the user has challenges because a lot of people won't know how to use those controls. And Google was in a position to say, well, we know how privacy exploitation has happened in the past or what mistakes have been made. So we'll just kind of take care of obfuscating this information for you and protect you a little bit. And I think, again, that was challenging for the industry and the regulatory bodies to accept because of Google's position in the advertising industry and how much of that they owned. And so it seems like the new model is more shift this power into the user's hands rather than sort of programmatically and automatically enforcing privacy behind the scenes through these APIs. So that's my take on, I think, what they tried to do and why I think it ultimately didn't work for the industry. What do you think, Florian?
Yeah, I actually think so Google's position in the advertising space certainly is on their technology around it, certainly is one of the reasons that was challenged from a regulation perspective. But I think the reason Google was getting so many eyes on it is also as simple as the fact that they're the number one browsers on the web for web traffic today. So I think very important for consumers going on the web is certainly another reason that people were paying attention, very close attention to what Google was doing, which was maybe somewhat less the case when Firefox or Safari made such announcements. And even to the point, today we're talking about the deprecation of third-party cookies or however you want to talk about it. But I haven't seen many conversations about Microsoft's plans. Microsoft earlier this year announced that they will also deprecate third-party cookies from Edge by the end of the year. I looked it up again earlier this morning to make sure. I haven't seen any updates from Microsoft on their plans following Google's announcements. So I find it also interesting that the position of Chrome has certainly a big reason for this influence. And again, to add on what you already explained on your perspective, I think the challenge that Google faced was also trying to make things change, right? The reason for this is to change the industry at the end of the day. Because of your reliance on third-party cookies, the change, to your point, is massive. And I think so many people in the industry were expecting things to be the same after these changes at the end of the day. It's kind of hard. The goal was not for Google to replace third-party cookies by something else that's exactly like third-party cookies. So I think that the challenge was partially, like, where do you put the limits? Like, how close to getting back to this old world does Google want to be? And I think they're balancing out certainly the needs and the requests and the pressure from publishers, from people monetizing customer data, alongside with advertisers on consumer needs.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what's been interesting all along is that I think there's an ongoing debate in the industry that hasn't been fully solved, which is that are cookies the problem, and what's stored in cookies the problem, or is the way that information gets shared behind the scenes between publishers, advertisers, those who own a great deal of customer data and identity information, is that the problem? And I think an easy way to short circuit the flow of information that may or may not be safe or private for users is to just get rid of the common language that publishers, advertisers, and others speak in the form of cookies. But I think ultimately it was deemed so disruptive that can't be the answer. But the thing that we don't want to see happen is that Google isn't able to, because they own such a lion's share of the browser activity, Google isn't able to provide individuals controls for their own privacy. People need to be able to make these decisions. They need to be able to decide how they want to interface with the internet. But on the flip side, publishers and businesses that have expensive websites to run and digital experiences to run need to have a way to monetize that so that we don't get charged $1.99 at the door every single time we try to go to ESPN.com. Like, that doesn't scale either, right? So I think everybody wants a system that it protects people, but it still allows for a viable, free, and open internet. And I think probably my take is that this is a net positive. I think there's advantages and disadvantages. But I think, TLDR, what we know Google is going to do now is ultimately probably not kill the third-party cookie altogether, which means that programmatic, particularly programmatic media businesses, are still going to be able to drop an artifact that allows them to calculate the end-to-end flow of advertising, the ad impression, and ultimately the ad conversion when somebody acts upon the intent of that advertising. They'll still be able to track that flow. I think what Google is going to do is probably follow a similar analog to iOS and Android, where users are now able to kind of at the device level, at the browser level, specify whether or not they want to be tracked. And I assume there will be some nuance there around what types of things you're willing to be tracked against. And then ultimately websites, because they are being loaded within that browser context, will have to play by those rules. And I think there will probably be some controls on whether or not third-party cookies are allowed to be set, read, used, manipulated, based on some global preferences from the users setting those things in the browser. One note on that, though, I think, everybody knows what happened with, I think it was iOS 14 or 15 when they first introduced, the default opt-out with Apple. I find it hard to believe that this model is going to be a default opt-out, because I think that would put Google in the same hot water where, if the vast majority of people don't even look at those controls and they're just off by default, and all of a sudden, 70, 80% match rates drop down to 2 or 3% match rates, I think that would be similarly disruptive to the broader industry. And I doubt regulators are going to be comfortable with that happening. And so my guess is that Google will allow users to control if their information gets shared, or at least if their cookies get shared. But that'll probably be an opt-in by default model. And then you can go through a process within the user experience of Chrome to opt out. So, my general take is that the general takeaway for the industry is that you're still going to be able to rely on third-party cookies, but they're going to be somewhat limited. We don't know how much they're going to be limited. There will probably be more significant opt-out rates than we've seen before. But they probably won't be as dramatic as maybe like Safari, Firefox, or, sort of iOS sort of opt-out rates that we've seen before. But again, it's a bit of speculation. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's the reality is we don't exactly know at this point. It's not clear. So eMarketers actually published a survey yesterday that announced the opt-in rate would be about estimated at 17% if it was a user level option. And so their estimate is that third-party cookies, if Microsoft moves on with deprecation of third-party cookies by end of year, in the future, obviously we don't have the date, we would have about 90% of the cookies gone, like third-party cookies. But to your point earlier, is it going to be opt-in? Is it going to be opt-out? It's hard to tell. Is it going to be device level? Is it going to be the same for every site? Or is it going to be very similar to IDFA, where every publisher, every website can ask the question? And can they ask in the way they would want? Can they ask when they want? There are a lot of unknowns. And like Google didn't really explain what drove their decision. Like, was it because the industry was not ready, or was it really the pressure from regulators? And likely a combination of the two. But the way I see that is they don't plan on deprecating third-party cookies. They just plan on giving the remote to someone else, to the consumers. Their plan is still the same. It's just they give the control away to not be pointed out as responsible for this, I think.
Yeah, and that may be a worth a thing to double click on real quickly. I mean, we spend a lot of time because at MetaRouter we spend a lot of time, negotiating with the vendor landscape. Let's call it, Meta and Trade Desk and others. And so it obviously would have a pretty big impact on the way that we communicate with those platforms through our libraries. And we were looking at what those vendors were doing, and as we were really, really, really approaching the timelines of when Google was going to start meaningfully cutting percentages of third-party cookies out of Chrome, people were barely starting to test. And so, we had seen some, tags and pixels and things be updated to have some privacy sandbox interfacing and some routes and things like that. But it certainly wasn't anywhere near full adoption. And so I think the easy answer here would be like, oh, they got pushback from the CMA and the regulatory bodies. They just weren't allowed to do it. I don't think that's probably the whole story. I think there was also, they probably came to the conclusion that they were fighting an uphill battle with the industry, and that the adoption, according to the timelines, when the adoption would really need to be solid for everybody's dashboards not to spin to zero, wasn't where it needed to be. And so that does, I think, leave the door open. I think the VP of Privacy Sandbox left the door open and said, look, we're going to continue to maintain these APIs for businesses that want to use them as a more private means with which to run an ads business. And I think that it is. Like, we looked at those APIs, and they do represent a well thought out and thorough alternative to the current model, which is more or less uninhibited access to data. And I think that there's some value to that, but I think probably a combination of factors led Google to back off. But I think probably the strongest one was that the industry just wasn't ready, and it wasn't compatible with their timelines. And as they kept pushing the timelines out, it just kept pushing the industry out from really being forced to adopt. And they felt like that was probably going to be a losing battle. But, again, that's a bit of speculation. So I think it would be smart at this point to maybe transition into, your take on, all right, so if cookies are still going to be around, but they're going to be limited, everybody wants an anonymous to known advertising strategy, audiencing strategy, attribution strategy, paid media strategy. How do you think businesses can best be equipped to live in a world where there's limited third-party cookie interactions, but they still exist? Programmatic still exists, but maybe loses some of its match and efficacy. How do you and ActionIQ think about guiding your customers through that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to see that is almost like nothing changes at the end of the day. Like, third-party cookies are already out of Firefox, they're out of Safari. So the reality is, people might see that as reduced pressure to apply the right strategies. But at the end of the day, if you want to be successful in your business, if you want to have a competitive edge, you still need to apply the same strategies that people have been talking about for the past few years. Those shouldn't change. taking an example of like a quick analogy, I went recently to Iceland on vacation. And when I was looking at the weather forecast and trying to figure out how to pack, like what to put on my suitcase, at the end of the day, the best advice that people were saying is you shouldn't even look at the forecast. It's going to change all the time. You just need to have multiple layers and be prepared. It might rain. The next hour is going to be super sunny. On the next hour, temperature is going to drop at 20 degrees.
Yeah.
I think the same applies here in our advertising space. You don't know what Google, Apple, Microsoft are going to do on when this is going to happen, but you need to take care of yourself, take care of your own strategy. So collecting high quality first party data, consented wherever you can, via value exchange, like tell customers, be transparent about why you're collecting the data, what data you're collecting, on what you plan on using it for. Having your own first party data is also giving you more control. We've seen like CAC increase, walled gardens just keep increasing prices because they own data that you're dependent on. If you reduce that dependency on their data, you can decide for yourself on again, get back in control. First party data is certainly the most important, but I would not ignore the opportunities to complete that with second party data. So creating a partnership ecosystem around that, around your business, and eventually third party data. Third party data will not go away. Third party cookies might, but third party data I'm sure will still exist on the web. The question is always about the quality of that data, on how much is it worth really. But so at the end of the day, I think going back to what I was saying earlier, your strategy certainly should remain the same, assuming that you have put in place the strategies in the past few years. If you haven't, my first recommendation is get started.
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously those who have any ability to redirect and leverage the investments that they make against first party data in a highly secure, private, compliant way, in a way that respects the same sorts of preferences that users would have, whether it's first or third party data. Google will probably provide controls around third party data, but you as a business need to be thinking about providing and respecting the preferences of users. Similarly, as you're collecting first party data, as you're collecting things like PII, collecting things like, for direct behavioral data and using that and monetizing that and figuring out advertising strategies around it. Compliance respect is really, really important. And I think you should be expecting your vendors to have those who are handling the data for you, those who are analyzing the data, audiencing against the data, collecting and distributing the data, integrating the data. You should be asking them and expecting them to respect consent and prove what sort of features and capabilities they have in place to respect consent. And then I think when it comes to the third-party strategy, I think the conversation should shift away from how much match am I getting on this data, and more to how can I use this data as a strong reach enhancement or supplemental execution against, relative to my first-party data. So, I think if like ActionIQ and MetaRouter have a great partnership where MetaRouter can kind of collect vendor IDs that are attributable in the paid media landscape, and then we can put those on profiles within ActionIQ so that ActionIQ, when doing audience activation, if first-party data is available, that's obviously the best and is going to have the best match. But the third-party IDs, let's say you're trying to activate an audience into Meta in order to run an advertising campaign, the vendor IDs from Meta that MetaRouter can collect can help increase the reach of that audience within Facebook. But that's the way it should be perceived. It should no longer be third-party data isn't valuable unless I can get 100% match rate on it. First of all, that's never been possible. Second of all, if users are choosing not to be included in that third-party anonymous set, that is absolutely their right, and it should be respected. So instead of this being, why can't I have 100% reach? It needs to be, there's a portion of my users that don't want to participate in this, and they should be excluded from it in both first and third-party contexts. And then those who do want to participate, you can continue to leverage third-party data to expand the reach and audience activation, or expand, the targeting that you're trying to do generally across the internet with programmatic players or in your marketing ecosystems. It should be considered an expansion and an additional reach multiplier. But ultimately, I think the foundation of your core strategy and your core value generation from your media efforts needs to be first-party data, and that needs to be consented first-party data when and where that's possible. And I think that can be an effective, if you have the means to analyze, segment, activate, and target users against that type of data, that is going to remain the most effective strategy in the industry. And assuming you as a business have strong InfoSec and strong compliance and privacy controls, and you're respecting the user's preferences through that motion, I think that will be the most sustainable way to continue to run your media and marketing business going forward.
Yeah, totally. At the end of the day, even if third-party cookies are not deprecated immediately or the way we expected by Google, like all those privacy pressures will not go away, and they will continue, right? In their announcements, Google added a small note about IP address going to be unavailable in incognito mode. Some of these changes will continue to happen across the industry.
Yeah.
So everything that's non-consented and anonymous will get harder to access.
Mm-hmm.
Working on the strategies is only preparing you for the future whenever it comes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Well, I think we're getting close to time. It's been a fun conversation. I haven't seen any comments come through. So, I think if there's anything, looks like we got one. Yeah, I think this one's for you, Florian.
I was actually not talking about match rates, but about the opt-in rate, the consent to use third-party cookies. So the comment was that according to e-marketers on their own internal surveys, about 90% of the browsing, of users browsing, will be inaccessible to third-party cookies, in essence, tracking. That includes Firefox, Safari, assuming that Microsoft will pursue their deprecation on Edge, and their estimate is 17% of Chrome users will opt in to be tracked.
Do you think that includes? Do you think they're assuming a default opt-out within Chrome in that?
Yeah, I looked for the same information, and you're right. I couldn't find it, but I assume that's the case. Yes.
Okay, so it could be. It seems like a worst case scenario is that 10% of third-party cookies will be all that's left. But, there's a chance that if Google doesn't do a default opt-out, it could be much higher than that.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. Even when I look for statistics, around IDFA, the reality is the opt-in rates not only varies per region, but also varies per industry. Like I was finding that gaming has the highest opt-in rate for IDFA, when other industries like education could go as low as single-digit opt-in. So it's very hard to predict. What you can be sure is it will significantly reduce the access you have today.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, it was great talking to you, man. Thanks for discussing this stuff. Obviously, we'll keep working together on this going forward. I think anybody on the call, that anything in this that inspired you to ask questions or try to learn more, feel free to reach out to either me or Florian, or reach out to our businesses through the normal channels. And thanks everybody for the time.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
All right.